He slammed him onto the hood and hissed, "People like you need to know who runs this neighborhood." The courtroom fell silent as the man looked up and said, "I've served in the U.S. Army for 20 years. You just assaulted an active duty colonel." What happened next shocked everyone. But let's start from the beginning.
You think court battles are crazy? Wait until you hear about the 75-year-old woman pregnant by her 19-year-old husband. It's not just a scandal. It's a shock. Society, family, friends, everyone's stunned by their story. At one point, they were ready to give up, but they didn't. How did their love survive all the obstacles? Click the suggestion to find out how this surprising story unfolds. Don't miss out on a love that defies every stereotype.
The courtroom doors creaked open, and Officer Brian Keener entered like a man who still thought he was in charge. His uniform was sharply pressed, every badge and button polished to a mirror shine. Dark aviator sunglasses hung from his shirt pocket, as if he still believed they gave him authority. He didn't make eye contact with anyone. He didn't need to. The look on his face said it all. I'm the law. I shouldn't even be here. But he was here, and not on duty. He walked past the jury box, past the bench, and sat at the defense table, hands folded neatly, jaw clenched. A bailiff closed the doors behind him with a heavy thud that seemed to shake the walls. The gallery was packed. Journalists, activists, retired officers, local residents, all here to see what many were already calling the trial that finally broke the badge. The court clerk called the session to order. Superior Court of Mecklenburg County is now in session. The Honorable Judge Marissa Holcomb presiding. Judge Holcomb entered with calm authority, late 50s, stern yet fair, known for her zero-tolerance approach to police misconduct. She took her seat, glanced over the room, and then looked down at the file in front of her. "Mr. Keener," she said, her voice echoing slightly, "you are charged with unlawful detainment, assault under color of law, perjury, and civil rights violations. How do you plead?" "Not guilty," Keener said immediately, his voice firm. His lawyer, Alan Redford, didn't flinch. They had rehearsed this. But the prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Carla Whitman, watched him like a hawk, expression unreadable. She stood, heels clicking softly as she moved to the center of the room. "Your Honor," she began, "this case is not about a misunderstanding. It's not about a single bad judgment call. This is about a pattern, a disturbing, unchecked abuse of power. And on July 3rd, that pattern finally broke a boundary it should never have crossed." The judge nodded. "Proceed." Whitman turned to the jury. "We'll begin with the arrest itself, the event that sparked this entire trial." She called her first witness. "Officer Keener, take the stand." Keener rose confidently and walked to the witness box. Even under oath, he sat like a man who believed the room owed him something. "State your name and former occupation for the record." "Brian Keener. I was a patrol officer with Hillside PD for 9 years. "You say was. You're no longer employed?" "I resigned," he said through clenched teeth. "After this incident?" "Yes." Whitman nodded. "Let's talk about July 3rd. What brought you to Eden Hill Lane?" "I was patrolling the area. I saw a suspicious vehicle parked outside a home, black SUV, tinted windows. The house had an uncut lawn, mailbox dented. I thought it could be abandoned or squatted." The courtroom shifted slightly. A few audience members whispered. Judge Holcomb tapped her gavel gently. "Order." Whitman didn't blink. "Did anyone call in the vehicle as suspicious?" "No," Keener admitted. "But in my experience—" "Your experience doesn't change the law," Whitman snapped. "Was there a parking violation?" "No." "Noise complaint?" "No." "Illegal activity?" "No." "Then why did you approach the vehicle, Officer Keener?" I had a gut feeling," Whitman took a breath. So based on your gut, you approached the SUV. What happened next? Keener's voice tensed. The driver didn't respond right away when I knocked. He was just sitting there. I asked him to exit the vehicle. He questioned why I was bothering him. Did he raise his voice? No. Did he threaten you? No. Was he armed? Not that I could see. Yet you proceeded to pull him from the vehicle and detain him. I asked him 3 times. He refused to comply. And what exactly did you say when you pulled him out of the vehicle, officer? Keener hesitated. I told him to stop resisting. Whitman stepped forward. Do you deny saying, quote, people like you need to know who runs this neighborhood? Gasps swept the gallery. A reporter's pen stopped mid-scribble. Even Keener's lawyer tensed slightly. I don't recall saying that, Keener said flatly. Whitman turned to the judge. Your Honor, we'll be playing body cam footage momentarily to clarify the officer's memory. Keener swallowed hard. For the first time, his mask cracked. The bailiff dimmed the lights. The footage began. Static. Wind. Then, get out of the vehicle. Now. A calm voice replied, I'm not sure why you're detaining me, officer. The voice that followed was unmistakable. Keener's. Get out now. I don't have time for your crap. People like you need to know who runs this neighborhood. There was no resisting, no yelling, just the sound of metal cuffs and a man being slammed against metal. The lights came back on. The courtroom was still. Keener looked smaller in his seat now. Whitman let the silence do the talking. Then, no further questions at this time. The judge turned to the defense. Mr. Redford. Keener's attorney stood slowly. No questions for the witness at this time, Your Honor. Keener returned to his seat, but not like before. Gone was the posture of control. His shoulders slumped just slightly. He wiped his palms on his thighs. The gallery? Burning. People weren't just watching, they were feeling it. The shock had morphed into something deeper, something personal. Hatred was beginning to take root, and this was only the first witness. The moment Colonel David Raines stepped up to the witness stand, the room shifted. He wasn't in uniform, but his presence made everyone sit straighter. African-American, late 40s, broad-shouldered, clean-shaven, his gaze was steady, the gaze of someone who had stared down real war zones, not the kind imagined by officers like Keener in their quiet suburban patrols. The bailiff swore him in, and he responded with a clear, calm, I do. He didn't look at Keener. He didn't need to. Keener stared at the floor. Whitman stood. Please state your name and background for the record. David Michael Raines, Colonel, United States Army, active duty, 23 years of service, Iraq, Afghanistan, and most recently instructor at Fort Bragg. You could feel the jury absorbing every syllable. Raines spoke like a man who didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. Colonel, Whitman continued, we're here to discuss what happened to you on July 3rd of this year. Could you walk us through that day? Yes, ma'am. He exhaled briefly. It was Sunday. I had driven down to check on my younger sister, Teresa. She's been undergoing chemotherapy and lives alone. She'd been struggling with basic upkeep, yard work, groceries, that sort of thing. He paused and glanced toward the jury. I parked on the street in front of her house, texted her I was outside. While I waited, I was going over the grocery list she sent. That's when I saw a patrol car pull up behind me. And what happened next? He hit the lights. No siren, just lights. I assumed he was stopping for someone else. I stayed in my seat. A moment later, Officer Keener approached on foot and tapped hard on my window. Did he say anything at first? No, just tapped. I rolled the window down and said, Afternoon, officer, can I help you with something? He didn't answer. Just said, Get out of the car. Did he explain why? No, ma'am. I asked, Is there a problem? He repeated louder, "Get out now!" He had one hand on his holster. Several jurors shifted uncomfortably. Raines continued, "I said, 'Sir, I'm just visiting my sister. I'm parked legally.' That's when he reached in, opened the door from the inside, and started pulling me out." "Did you resist?" "I kept my hands visible. I said, 'Sir, I'm active duty military. I'm not resisting.' He shoved me against the hood, hard. My head hit the metal. He called me a punk and said—" Raines looked away briefly. His throat tightened for just a second. He said, "People like you need to know who runs this neighborhood." A collective breath caught in the gallery. One juror's hand gripped the side of the box. Whitman gave him a moment. Then, "Colonel, were you armed?" "No, ma'am." "Did you raise your voice at any point?" "No, ma'am." "Did you ever pose a threat?" "No." I identified myself again. I said, "I'm Colonel David Raines, United States Army." And he laughed. He said, "I don't give a damn about your little Halloween costume." Then he cuffed me and pushed me into the back of the squad car. Silence. Not the kind of silence where people wait for the next line. The kind where people process. Whitman let the moment stretch, then stepped back. "No further questions." The judge looked to the defense table. "Mr. Redford?" Keener's attorney stood slowly. He approached the stand with forced calm. "Colonel Raines, thank you for your service. I just have a few questions." Raines gave a polite nod. "You said Officer Keener asked you to exit the vehicle. Is it possible he believed there was danger inside? You didn't exit when asked." Raines looked him directly in the eye. "I was calm. I asked for a reason. That's not resisting. That's a citizen asking a question." Redford pressed on. "But wouldn't you agree officers have to make fast decisions? Especially if they believe someone may be armed?" Raines' expression darkened slightly. "I've led operations in combat zones. I know what a threat looks like. Sitting calmly in a parked SUV while texting your sister about groceries is not a threat." A few people in the gallery nodded silently. Redford was losing the room. "One final question, Colonel. Do you believe this was a misunderstanding, or do you believe there was intent to humiliate me?" Raines cut in. "Yes, there was intent. I've been black in America long enough to know when someone's not looking at my behavior and they're looking at my skin." Redford froze. "Nothing further," he muttered, and returned to his seat. Raines stepped down, composed. Every eye followed him. He didn't speak again. He didn't need to. The judge called a recess. The gavel struck. As the crowd slowly filtered out for the break, a low buzz of emotion spread through the hallways. Anger was no longer an abstract idea. It had a face, a voice, a uniform that wasn't blue, but carried real authority and pain. Back inside the courtroom, Keener sat pale. His lawyer leaned in and whispered something. He didn't respond. For the first time since the trial began, Officer Keener looked afraid. And the public? They weren't afraid. They were furious. And they wanted more than answers. They wanted accountability. The courtroom reassembled after the recess with a changed atmosphere. Heavier, angrier. Colonel Raines's testimony had pierced through the room like a steel blade, and now the prosecution was ready to twist it deeper. ADA Carla Whitman stood again, this time holding a folder marked Internal Affairs. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady but charged, "the state would like to enter into evidence prior citizen complaints filed against Officer Keener during his tenure with the Hillside Police Department." Defense Attorney Redford was on his feet instantly. "Objection. These complaints were dismissed or sealed. They are not relevant." Judge Holcomb didn't even blink. "Overruled. If the state can establish a pattern, the jury is entitled to see it. Proceed, Ms. Whitman? Keener shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His eyes flicked toward the jury, then to the public gallery, then away again. Whitman stepped forward and read aloud. Exhibit 9B. Complaint from 2019. A black teenager was stopped for riding his bike without a helmet. The officer allegedly drew his weapon. No charges filed. Exhibit 11A. Complaint from 2020. A Latino father of 2 detained while unloading groceries. No arrest, no probable cause, no apology. Exhibit 12C. Complaint from 2021. A black female postal worker threatened with citation for loitering while delivering mail. The list went on. The pattern was clear. Each time Officer Keener had faced no real consequences. Each time the victims were people of color. Each time the department closed ranks around him. A chilling murmur rippled across the courtroom. Jurors scribbled notes. Some stared straight at Keener, who now sat frozen, his hands tight fists on the table. Whitman didn't let up. We now call retired Sergeant Wendell Hart to the stand. A man in his late 60s took the stand. White, tired eyes, weathered hands. His voice, though quiet, carried decades of experience. I was Officer Keener's direct supervisor for 5 years, Hart said. I warned him repeatedly about his conduct. He had what we called control issues. He didn't de-escalate. He escalated. Whitman stepped closer. Can you describe the internal response? Hart's face hardened. We looked the other way. Not everyone, but enough. There's a culture that protects the badge instead of protecting people. Was there ever disciplinary action taken? One written reprimand. That's it. Everything else was unfounded or quietly shelved. Whitman nodded. Do you believe this trial is the first time Officer Keener has overstepped his authority? Hart didn't hesitate. No. It's just the first time he couldn't cover it up. Defense objected again. Speculative. But the damage was done. The jury was already deep in thought. The gallery sat in stunned silence. Whitman turned to the judge. The state now moves to play additional footage from Officer Keener's body cam, unedited and in full context. Judge Holcomb gave a single nod. The room dimmed. The screen came alive again. This time we saw what came after the arrest. Keener pacing near his cruiser, muttering. He thinks he's a big man. Colonel. Probably just some made-up title. Then a dispatcher's voice crackled through his radio. Confirm. David M. Raines, active duty, Colonel, U.S. Army, clearance level Alpha. Proceed with extreme caution. Keener stiffened. He clicked off his mic. Then he looked directly into the body cam lens. Oh, hell. The screen froze. Gasps. Then whispers. Then outrage. Whitman let it breathe. This is not a man who made a mistake. This is a man who knew exactly what he did, and panicked when he realized who he did it to. She turned slowly toward the jury, and he only panicked because he thought this time he might not get away with it. The judge called for order as the tension inside the room nearly boiled over. Defense tried to rally, calling Keener back to the stand for redirect, but it was too late. Keener was cracking. On the stand, his voice lost its steel. I didn't mean to hurt him, he said. He looked like trouble. Whitman stood for cross-examination again. Define looked like trouble, officer. Keener's mouth opened, then closed. He didn't belong there. Because he was black? I didn't say that. No, but you thought it, and your badge made you think you could act on that thought without consequences. Keener's lip twitched. I was doing my job. No, you were abusing it. The courtroom went silent again, but not the kind of silence that waits for what's next, the kind that judges. the kind that condemns. For the first time, the power wasn't in Keener's hands. It was in the hands of the very people he thought he could control. A jury of 12, an audience of millions, a judge with no patience left, and the unraveling wasn't just of one man's career. It was of a system that let it happen again and again. The final day of the trial arrived under gray skies and pouring rain. Outside the courthouse, a growing crowd gathered. Activists, veterans, local residents, reporters. Some held signs that read, "Justice for Raines." Others simply watched in tense silence. They weren't there for drama. They were there to witness accountability. Inside, the courtroom felt colder than usual. Officer Brian Keener, no longer in uniform, now in a dark suit with no tie, sat beside his attorney, pale and stone still. Days ago, he radiated control. Now he looked like a man waiting for gravity to finish its work. The judge entered and called the court to order. The jury filed in, their faces unreadable. 12 ordinary citizens about to decide the fate of a man who thought he was untouchable. "Madam Foreperson," Judge Holcomb said, "has the jury reached a verdict?" A woman in her early 50s, composed and calm, stood with the verdict slip in hand. "Yes, Your Honor." She passed it to the bailiff, who handed it to the judge. The pause was unbearable. Judge Holcomb unfolded the paper and read aloud, "We, the jury, find the defendant, Brian Keener, guilty on all counts." Gasps broke across the courtroom. Guilty of unlawful detainment. Guilty of assault under color of law. Guilty of perjury. Guilty of violating the civil rights of Colonel David Raines. For a long moment, Keener didn't react. It was as if his brain hadn't accepted the words yet. Then his shoulders slumped. His jaw trembled. He looked toward the gallery, perhaps hoping to see sympathy. He found none. The judge turned to sentencing immediately. "Mr. Keener," she said, voice firm but even, "you wore a badge that gave you authority, but you used it not to protect, but to dominate. You were not enforcing law. You were enforcing ego. That ends today." Keener's lawyer rose. "Your Honor, my client has no prior convictions. She raised a hand. "Save it." Then to Keener, "I sentence you to 4 years in state prison. You will serve no less than 3 before being eligible for parole. You are hereby stripped of all legal protections afforded by your former role. Your record will reflect your status as a felon. You will never hold a badge again." The gavel hit the block. It was done. Keener was cuffed before he could fully process what had happened. His hands, once used to control others, now bound at the wrist. He didn't resist. He didn't speak. As he was led past the gallery, his eyes met those of Colonel Raines, who stood, hands clasped, unmoved. There was no hatred in Raines' expression, only finality. Outside, cameras flashed as Keener was taken to the transport van. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't boo. They simply watched. This, they understood, was what justice was supposed to look like. Inside the courthouse lobby, a reporter rushed toward Raines. "Colonel, any comment on the verdict?" He stopped, looked straight into the camera. "I didn't want revenge," he said. "I wanted truth, and I wanted to remind people that wearing a badge doesn't make you a god. It makes you accountable." A quiet pause. "She deserved better," he added. "My sister, my community, this country." He walked away without another word. Back in the empty courtroom, Judge Holcomb remained seated for a few moments longer. She looked over her bench, taking in the silence after the storm. She knew this wasn't the end of anything. Not really. But it was a start. She whispered, almost to herself, "Finally." Later that night, a clip of the verdict went viral. One moment in particular, the second Keener realized he'd lost control, became the symbol of the trial. Millions watched it on loop, but what stayed with people wasn't his fall. It was the dignity of the man who stood across from him. Quiet, calm, unshaken. Colonel Rains never raised his voice. He didn't have to.